Hey, it's Paul. Before we get started, we need to make sure that you, the listener, knows that we are not mental health professionals and not qualified to prescribe therapies or therapeutic advice. We are also not your gurus and have no aspirations in that direction. We are simply two people who are trying to feel better and do better in our lives, just like you. And now, on with the show.
Freedom, freedom, freedom over fame, freedom over cycle stays the same.
We tend, all of us, to have a fairly self-centered worldview. We walk through the world exuding main character energy and view ourselves as separate from others and from nature.
But is this the truth of reality, or is there an underlying energy that connects us each to each other and to the world we live in? Taking that a step further, is it possible that all there is this energy and everything we take to be the real world is just an illusion?
Today on the show, we're talking about oneness, or non-duality as it's called in some spiritual traditions, and how adopting a non-dual worldview can help us to feel more connected to ourselves, to each other, and to the experience of our lives. So if you're ready for takeoff,
let's go.
Freedom, freedom, freedom over fame, freedom over fame. The cycle stays the same.
Okay, Paul.
Yes.
You wanted to talk
Nora.
about this today, and let's dive into this.
Let's dive into it.
First off, why did you want to talk about this?
Well, I want to talk about it because we are experiencing like an unprecedented level of feeling separate from each other, I think, in the world. It's only gotten worse since the pandemic, I would say. And, with our politics, especially in this country, and with our other divides that we experience, as being reality, I wanted to talk about my experience with non-duality and non-dual traditions, and how a sense of oneness can help us get out of what we're in right now, which is a real sense of separation from each other and from nature, which we're apart.
Yeah, I like that. I think, at least in my lifetime, I don't think I've ever really experienced the division in so many ways.
Yeah.
I know in our history, we had like a civil war here before.
Yeah, certainly. Yeah,
So,
certainly it has always
hopefully
been
that
there.
will be Civil War 2.0, but
No, and it's, I don't mean to really say unprecedented, because that's not true. It probably unprecedented in our lifetimes, maybe, or maybe not even that, because certainly when I was born in the 60s, there was a lot of division between, even within families, over the Vietnam War and things like that, and the hippie movement, all that stuff. So it's always been there, and it's been there for thousands of years. But the truth is, it largely has to do with the way we look at things. And like the problem with thinking that we're separate is it creates, as we said, political divides over race, divides over religions, gender, separation from nature, which is why we feel free to pollute and rape the planet. And relationship troubles, even within relationships, our sense of separateness from our partner can create real, a lack of empathy and a lack of compassion in a relationship. And it also just buys into that, good old American cowboy individualism mentality.
John Wayne.
The lone rider type of thing. That's just not, I don't think it's so healthy and so good for us to think in that direction.
Yeah, it definitely leads us away from community, that's for sure.
Yeah, definitely, right? I mean, and it makes you think that you have to do everything yourself as well. That's the thing. This is why people don't ask for help. This is why people don't collaborate enough. This is why we have a sense of competition instead of cooperation, in the country. Like all of those things, it all comes from, I think, this sense of separation that we have.
I think it also fosters, yes to everything you said, and I think it also fosters this idea that a lot of people seem to adopt this mentality that, they're in a vacuum and that, they did it all by themselves. Quote unquote.
Yeah.
Which, no, all of the knowledge that has ever existed.
No.
No, it's like all of the knowledge that has been, passed down to us from generation to generation.
Sure.
About the world we live in, you didn't do that by yourself.
We're
all on the shoulders of the people who became
giants.
Before us. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's why that saying exists. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and that's how we know what we know, and we do what we do. Unfortunately, some of that knowledge that got passed down hasn't have anything to do with reality. It has to do with this weird individualism idea that we have, especially in this country, right? So. I guess I want to talk first about like what is this non-duality thing, because I'm sure a lot of our
Mhm.
listeners are like, I don't even know what that is. It sounds religious. It sounds weird. I don't know. I don't get what it is. Right. So
Right.
the definition of non, okay, first of all, so what I have done a lot of reading in is one particular tradition. I've kind of gone around the spiritual world, but Advaita Vedanta is a Hindu. Advaita means non-dual or not two, and non-dualism means just that same thing, not
I
two. And the
real
idea
quick,
is,
I
yeah.
just need to, for the listeners, not two as in TWOs and the number
Oh
2,
yes, yeah,
just
yeah.
to clarify.
TWO is
Yes.
not dual, non-dual. Yeah,
Right.
not two. So the best analogy you can think, what I mean, it's just the philosophy is more or less that underlying everything, there's one thing, one energy, and you can call that God, you can call that the universe, you can call that the ultimate reality, you can
And
call
call it
that
one love, like
truth, you can
yeah,
call it
one
one love,
love,
like Bob
like Bob
Marley.
Marley.
Anything like that, right? You can call that. There's this energy that things manifest out of, and we are those things. So the best analogy I think that the Hindus use all the time, Advaita Vedanta is part of Hinduism, by the way, is that there's an ocean, like a vast, endless ocean, and that is that energy that I'm talking about, and all the things that manifest out of it are the waves, right? They have
Mhm,
the beginning they all have a beginning and an end. It's our lives. It's nature. It's everything has that. Everything that exists here in this dual world, because we live in a dual world of opposites, right? You can't have dark without light. You can't have,
mhm,
I mean, name anything, and you can't think of it without its opposite, right?
yep,
This is why it's so difficult to think of abstractions like eternity. You can't really picture eternity in your head because it doesn't have any. It doesn't
yeah,
have another side to it, right?
right,
It's just endless. And so it's difficult to grasp that stuff. And we'll talk about the problem with using language to try to get across these points, because some of them will seem paradoxical, some will be hard to grasp onto, and so we use a lot of analogies and
mhm,
a lot of concepts and a lot of intelligent thought to try to wrap our brains around this. But ultimately, this all has to do with experience. But we'll get to that part.
yep,
So the ocean wave analogy, I think that's an easily graspable one for most people, right?
mhm,
And it's also quite affirming, in a lot of ways that, before you were born, you're part of this ocean. After you die, you go back into this ocean. You're still ocean. Like the real true you is still sure the body, the ego, like everything with it, the thoughts, all that. Yes, that dies when your life is over. But the idea is that, there is a part of you, what the Hindus would call the Atman, that returns to Brahman, which is the ground of creation, the ground of being.
mhm. I think I don't know that if you actually just said it, but, the ocean analogy that Paul is talking about is that, like, the ocean represents universal consciousness, right?
Yeah.
And that the waves that come of the ocean is still part of the ocean, but we see them as, like, individual, but they're still the ocean. They're just kind of
Right.
movement of the ocean, and so the waves crash and then go back into the ocean, and that represents, like, our consciousness, our, like,
Our lives.
our
Yeah.
lives,
Yeah.
exactly,
Our
and
manifestations here. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. Another way I've kind of wrapped my head around it, as an example, is that, like, if you look at your hand in front of you and you have the palm of your hand, that would be, like, the universe, God, consciousness, universal consciousness, whatever the heck you wanna call it, love,
Yeah.
whatever, and then all of the fingers that are coming out of your hand are, like, the individual expressions that would, like, represent people or ourselves or whatever, and those all come from it's all the hand, it's all the
Yeah.
same thing, but they're just, like, kinda, like, spokes out of it.
Yeah.
Uh,
And the idea is that we make the mistake of just looking at at waves
the
as
finger.
individual things,
Yeah,
or just
mhm,
the finger
mhm,
and not the hand, or the wave and not the ocean. This is an idea of misperception that's in a lot of spiritual traditions. So what traditions have this in it? Not just spiritual traditions, but you've got Taoism with the yin and the
mhm,
yang symbol, two seemingly opposites, but they are ultimately one thing joined together.
mhm,
Um, there's certainly ideas of non-dualism in Buddhism. There's ideas of non-dualism in quantum mechanics with the idea of superposition and Schrodinger's cat type of thing. Like there's until the waveform collapses, you don't know what's what in there. I'm not going to get deep into quantum
yeah,
physics because let me tell you, I have a
leave that
limited
to the
grasp
pros.
on even what I just talked about there.
Right,
Right. So It's not it's certainly not a new idea. It's been around for thousands of years, certainly in Hinduism,
Mm-hmm.
which is, probably the oldest recorded religion that we have, right?
Mm-hmm.
That with so much in it, so it's, we're talking at least 5,000 years old for some of these concepts, right? When we're talking about
They old,
Hinduism, right?
yo.
Yeah, they're old. Yep.
They old. Yeah.
So why is it difficult to grasp, right? Well, let's talk about the limitation of language first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like I said, we live in this dual world where we don't understand anything that doesn't have an opposite to it, right?
Right.
Good, bad, dark, light. I don't know,
Peace war,
ugly, pretty, peace,
yeah.
war, anything,
Mhm.
anything you can think of has an opposite to it, right? And the idea of non-duality is there is no opposite. There's only one thing.
Yeah.
And that thing is God, or that thing is the ultimate reality, or like we said, anything you want to call it. I'm going to dispense with saying that every single time and just call it what I want, whether I call it God or ultimate reality. You'll understand what
Same
I'm
thing.
talking about,
Right.
listeners, from here on in, because I don't want to have to qualify that every time,
Every
because
time.
I don't believe there's a difference
It gets
anyway. So
exhausting.
it gets
Exactly.
exhausting. I
Yeah,
don't
you're
really
like,
care. Right.
okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, so we have this language and concepts. We can only think about things in terms of their opposites. And that's why analogies are helpful to get us there. But at some point, you have to kind of get into the experience. Like words will walk you up to the door, but then you got to walk through it and experience what this is. And we're going to talk about how we get there, and in terms of our meditation practice, how you and I do it. Not that we're fully realized masters. We
No.
certainly are not, but we have had glimpses of this idea, right? In both of our meditations, we've talked about it before. But one of the main things I want to talk a little bit more about our faulty perceptions, because there's a couple helpful analogies, one from Hinduism and one from Plato, oddly enough. And the first one that they talk about all the time in Hinduism is the mistaking the rope for the snake, right? It's called the snake and the rope. And so the idea is a person walks along a dimly lit path and sees what appears to be a snake, and they get frightened and they react as if they're facing a real snake. But when they get closer, they realize that it's just a coiled up rope on the ground, and the fear subsides as they understand the true nature of what they're seeing, right? So in a non-dual sense, the rope represents the underlying unchanging reality, that ocean that we talked about before, often referred to as Brahman in Hinduism, right? Which is just the ultimate reality, God, whatever you would call it. Then the snake represents the world of appearances, right? What we think is real all the time. The world of appearances, like separate objects that we typically perceive, right? And the dim light symbolizes our limited understanding or awareness of those things. So the fear reaction represents our engagement with the world as if perceptions were ultimately real, right? So we're mistaking that rope for the snake. We get scared, but there's nothing to be scared of. We just made that whole thing up, right? That whole thing was just a misperception in our minds. And so the closer inspection, or the added light, represents the dawning of true knowledge, or the awakening to the fact that, it's not a snake there, right? And Plato's cave is much the same thing in a lot of ways. If you're not familiar, it's from Plato's Republic, right? The prisoners are chained in a cave facing a blank wall, and behind them there's a fire, but in between them and the fire, there's people going back and forth and all the things, but all they can see are the shadows on the wall.
Projection of it.
And so they think the shadows on the wall are reality because they've never seen anything else, right? Until one of them escapes and gets outside and realizes that's not reality at all. This is reality. So in a sense, he's had a spiritual awakening of sorts and realized what the ultimate reality is. And he comes back in to tell the other prisoners, and they don't believe him.
Because they didn't experience it.
Because they haven't experienced it. And that's another part. That's another one of the shortcomings of trying to use language to explain what reality is in this non-dual sense, because unless you've experienced a glimpse of it or something like that, you can't really conceive of what we're talking. You can get it in an intellectual sense, but in an experiential sense, you have to go outside the cave and look around and see what reality actually is. So I just wanted to say, do those things with our misperceptions, because those are important to understand how we often misperceive the world. Like if you think about memory and stuff, that happens to us all the time too, right?
I actually want to back it up a second there and go back to what we're talking about with language and the limitations of language and the construct of language, really. That's the thing. Like language is a construct, like many of the things that we mistake as like total reality, right?
Yeah.
And the thing with language is it's what we have best to communicate, how we experience the world, and all of us experience it differently. But also the enormous amount of data that our brains are taking in to make sense of the world that we communicate through language, right?
Yeah.
And language is often limiting. And you were talking about, I know we talked about this before. We didn't talk about it in this episode, but if you if you experience the world and you don't have a name for things, things are still kind of like open and wondrous, right? If you are,
Yeah.
I was saying like to Paul recently, like one of the things that I'm very fascinated by is ocean life, right? And part of the reason I'm fascinated by it is like there's so much novelty in ocean life, and there's still so much life in the ocean that we have not yet experienced, that we're still discovering as humans. And then we have to like name it in order to, it's like name it to tame it, right? Like
Yeah.
name it in order to make sense of what it is. And
I like
what
how you have a rhyme for everything. Name it to tame it. Like everybody says that all the time. Nobody says
never heard
says
of
that. No.
Oh, I
Probably have heard of it, but not too. You don't go around saying it on the street. But I love how they just flow
my
out of your mouth
scientific
like
nursery rhyme.
that. Fantastic. I love it. You got to name it to claim it. To
Yeah,
tame it. Whatever.
tame it. Come on.
Yeah.
But once you name it, it becomes, it's like it gets filed away as like data, and it doesn't have like the wonder and like the kind of the awe of it, right?
Yeah.
And it's like you said with what is it, the bird? Like once you
It was
name
a Krishnamurti quote, right?
That's
That
right.
says, once you teach the child the name of the child never sees the bird again.
right?
Because you can just say, okay, well, your brain goes, okay, I've categorized that. Now we can ignore it. Whereas
Right.
if you run across a bird and you treat it like you've never seen a bird before, it's a whole different experience. That's hard to do, obviously. We've all seen birds before. You know what a blue jay is. But, I've been trying to walk around recently and just encounter the natural world with
And the
that
wonder
sort
of
of, the wonder of it
Mhm.
without trying to categorize it and move on. But just look at this thing. I was in front of a pear tree the other day. It was freaking amazing, man. I mean, it's incredible what a fruit tree does. I mean, if you stop and look at it, I mean, I know I sound insane, but
No, I don't.
it was quite
I'm right
a
there with you.
religious experience for me.
No, I get that. So I have a short little example of this. I
Yeah.
have some good friends that were staying at our house this summer with their two young girls. And their one daughter is around 10 years old, and she's adorable and gets a little sassy and stuff.
Yeah.
And I was looking out the front window, and where I live, we have lightning bugs for a limited time during the summer. But so I love lightning bugs, or fireflies, however you want to call them. And I was looking out the window, and they were all lighting up, and I called my friend's daughter over, and I was like, "Hey, come over here, come over here." And she's like, "What?" And I'm like, look out the window." And she looks out the window, and she's like, "Yeah, so what? They're lightning bugs. I've seen lightning bugs before." And I was like, so I just like kind of, ribbed her a bit, and I was like,
Mocked her.
"Ooh, yeah." As I'm so good at doing to 10-year-olds.
Yeah.
And I was like, "Ooh, oh, but how boring. There's a bug that flies around whose butt lights up in the air for a limited time. How boring is that?" And she just,
Right.
she got my point, and she started laughing, and then was like,
Yeah.
became more engaged. But it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like the fact that we become bored by this world that is filled with like incredible things that are changing and growing, and like ecosystems all the time, that
Just
we're
because
just
we've
like,
seen it before, too. That's the
whatever.
thing. Oh, I've
Yeah.
seen
Or
that.
whenever
Oh,
there's a
please.
volcano exploding,
Right?
like,
The wonder of
eh,
nature, blah, blah,
yeah.
blah. Let me get back on the phone.
B-,
Yeah. 2 stars would
Yeah,
not do
exactly.
again. Yeah, sorry.
It's just insane. But like that, that kind of proves the point of just like when we kind of lose our engagement in things,
Yeah.
when we start just like classifying it into our little scientific, minds of like, all right, well, we know what that is, and next,
Yeah.
So anyway,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
just had to share that.
No, that's
Yeah.
great. I mean, that's a great way to reconnect with to realize your connection to the natural world again, is to go
Mhm.
around and try to do that. Can you do that with people too? Certainly you can. You can do
Yeah.
that with anything, right?
Yeah,
I mean, try to
absolutely.
engage somebody you know really well as if you've never known them, I mean,
Yeah.
or as if,
Well, that's the thing. Do we fully know anyone, right?
well, yeah, you don't. You can't know
Yeah.
you can't know another person's inner experience anyway. I mean, you never
Absolutely.
truly know anybody and what's going on within them. The only way you can do that is through language, which,
Mhm.
as we know, is faulty. And, what the snake in the rope points out and what Plato's cave points out is our senses are also faulty,
Yep.
right? It's
Yeah.
not like we move around with these limited 5 senses, but this is not true reality, right? If you think, I was talking to you the other day about the mantis shrimp, which sees many more
Mhm.
colors than we do, right? We
Mhm.
can't even conceive of a color that we haven't seen before. Everything we conceive of is a mixture of the colors that we know in the spectrum that we can see.
Yep.
Right. But a mantis shrimp has crazy psychedelic, like color vision. Right. And do all those colors exist in the world? They absolutely do, because the mantis shrimp is perceiving them,
Right.
but we're not perceiving them. Right.
Right.
Or think of somebody who's been deaf since birth or blind since birth. They engage with the world in a completely different way. way,
Absolutely.
and probably have a completely different experience of what life is than people who are sighted and not hearing impaired.
Yeah, I would say we're limited by our five senses.
Yeah, for sure. But we don't bother to look beyond them because they're the way that we engage with the
Right.
world, right? And
Right.
so non-duality invites you to look beyond senses, beyond concepts, beyond your ideas, beyond your thoughts, certainly,
Or just
and beyond.
contemplate it. Like, that's the
Yeah,
thing. I don't even know that it
exactly.
says that it like makes you look at it as much as just contemplate that there might be more to what you perceive and what you experience. And
Right.
we can see that, I mean, even down to when it comes to people's personal truth.
Yeah.
Like my personal truth walking around as a white woman in America and the world is going to be wildly different than, brown women and black men and all over the world. It's of course it's going to be different because we have different experiences and in the time and places that we are in the world. So,
Yeah.
but
Not to
I
mention,
go ahead.
it's
Go ahead.
not just perceptions, but it's also like if you think about moral relativism, right, which says that that throughout cultures and different people, that the idea of morality can differ greatly, and that we should
Mhm.
maybe accept everybody's different ideas of
Yeah.
morality because that's what comes from their culture. Now that has its downsides, obviously, and sort of
I
license to
mean,
be horrible to other people,
all you have
but
to look at is our abortion politics
right,
in
well, yeah,
America, right?
exactly,
Like,
exactly, but so, I mean, we don't even experience the same morality across the world or anything like that, too.
mhm.
So there's a lot there. I don't mean to get like way off in the weeds
No,
here,
no, no.
but let's
But I hear what you're saying, and I
yeah,
like what you're saying. I do
yeah,
think it's all interconnected with this. So,
yeah.
um,
Let's get on to like how do we get to a greater sense of this oneness though? Because I'm sure people are
mhm.
like, yeah, okay, but how's that? Like, I don't
How does this
feel it,
happen?
I
Right.
don't do it, I don't think it, and so let's start with our meditation practices that we do, right?
Right.
And what we call taking the seat of the observer, right?
Mhm.
So the seat of the observer is a way to go back and back and back in your mind until nothing else can observe. So here's the idea, right? If your eye observes an object, right?
Mhm.
That's the subject object relationship, right? Your eye and the object. And then if you go one step back, you can't perceive any of that without your mind. So there's
Right.
the mind connection to the eye that analyzes what it's seeing. That right. You go back one step from the mind and you get to the seat of the observer, where in meditation, what you're trying to get to is where you can just sit and observe your thoughts,
Mhm.
observe your experiences, like what arises in your body, but also your thoughts. And then you gently release those thoughts until the thoughts get fewer and fewer in there. And you get to sort of a clearer state in your mind.
Yeah,
Right.
I have a simple practice for this
Yeah.
to try to explain to people,
Do it.
especially who don't for folks who don't, like, understand what the seat of the observer is, or if you have the concept of it, but haven't experienced it, like, it's kinda hard to grasp that unless you're, like, I mean, Paul and I've been practicing daily meditation for nearly a decade now, so
Yeah.
I have a better sense of it. I have, like, the ROI of meditation at this point. But here's a simple kind of thought process to think. If you close your eyes and I say, "Okay, I want you to think about an apple." And so you and observe, like, just think of an apple, right? And so your thought is probably generating an image of an apple. Now that's the apple is your thought. What's perceiving the apple, right? That is what that is, that energy is what people would say is consciousness. That's the observation. The apple that I just told you to think about is your thought. So many people attach their thoughts as like their reality. The
Mm-hmm.
reality is whatever that energy is that is observing the apple and is able to say that is an apple in your thought
Yes.
process. Does that make
Yeah.
sense?
Yes, it makes
Okay.
100% sense. And that is, that observer seat is where you it has no, it's not a thing. It has no
Right.
qualities itself.
Mhm.
That's why it's the observer seat, right?
Mhm.
It's not a chair you sit in and look at your stuff. It's the space in which everything is in which
Observe.
everything is allowed to occur,
Yep.
in which everything is observed. It's non-judgmental. It doesn't have any opinions. It doesn't have any judgments on anything. It's
Just
just
experiences.
experiences. Yeah,
Yep.
that's it, right? And it doesn't label things good or bad. You go one step forward into your mind, that's where all that stuff happens,
Right.
right? You can observe your thought, and then all of a sudden your mind latches onto that thought and creates a feeling in your body. You take that thought as reality, and then off you go to the
Exactly.
races down the
Right.
drain, right?
Even when
That's
it comes to, like, you're thinking about a scenario that played out or that might play out and you're creating emotions around that, whether it's anger or anxiety or anything like that, because your thought process is thinking about something that either did or may happen or may not happen, and you're attaching to it, and you're attaching your emotions to it because it's like creating this like your brain doesn't know what's real or what is it like what's like
You
true
tell it.
experience
Yeah.
until you tell it, right? And so I think so many people go about their life and they're reactive because they don't know that like thoughts are just thoughts,
Yeah.
right? So if you can get to a place where you keep practicing and get to a place where you start cultivating that like, oh, okay, I am able to observe my thoughts right now. Like there have been so many times where I got lost in my thoughts and like would get like angry or upset about a scenario that didn't even play out. And then I'm like, what wasted energy is this?
Right.
But like this is the benefit of meditation. If you keep practicing it and you keep kind of like doing the gym reps with your brain to get to that seat of the observer and see like, oh, these are just thoughts. They're kind of like clouds. Like you can observe the clouds, but over the clouds, the sun is always shining.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
that's the
And
consciousness that we're talking about, the universal one.
yeah, and it's important, I think, to mention that you're not trying to destroy those thoughts and you're not trying to push them away
Right.
because, as we
Just let 'em
know,
go.
what you resist persists, right? And so
Yep.
don't resist those thoughts. You just gently let them, just observe them and
Yep.
just let them pass by themselves. They'll be gone. You'll get another thought in 2 seconds. You know,
Yep.
it's like an endless train station. They just keep coming, just keep coming. You know,
Grand
it's
Central, man.
but I was going to say, this is also how you know you're not in the present moment, right? If you're attached to a thought, you're not in the present moment because you're
Yep.
either in the past or the future, right? So you're either thinking about something that hasn't happened yet or that has happened in your past. You attach to that and down the spiral you go, right?
Yep.
If you're in the present moment, all you're doing is observing in that present moment. So that's how that is also what, you know, a lot of people, if you don't really get with the idea of like be in the present moment, that's what it is. That's what
Yeah.
it is being. It's just being here, not in the future
Like
or the
Ram Dass
past.
said, be
Yeah.
here now. Yep.
Exactly. Be here now. You got
Yeah,
it.
because that's all
And
that actually exists.
yeah. Yeah.
Yep.
It's the eternal
That's it.
now because
Yep.
because nothing else is true, right?
And time
The
is a
future's
construct.
and time's a construct. It's a flat circle, man.
Here you go,
Yeah.
man.
It's just Matthew McConaughey in True Detective, the first season. I love it.
Sorry.
No,
As
it's
you were
okay. We're
saying, Paul.
sidetracked. It's good. I was just going to add one more analogy about this, and that's the movie screen analogy that I think Ramana Maharshi used quite a bit, and certainly some other non-dual teachers that I've been with, I've listened to and read, and that is, you know, if you think of yourself as, if you think of your true nature as the screen, and you think of your experiences and your thoughts as images that play out on the screen, if you're in a movie theater, it's another good way to good thing, because the screen is unchanging. The screen doesn't care whether it's a cowboy movie or an action movie or a romance. It doesn't care what's on it. It is just there to reflect, to allow the projection of those things. Now, the screen doesn't get upset when the movie's sad, and the screen doesn't get upset when there's, something fearful on it or anything. It's just the screen. And that is another way to think of your awareness, right? It's just, or your consciousness, is that it's a screen in which your entire life is projected on, or your experience of this life is projected on. And you don't need to attach to those projections. Those are just the projections that are going by. Again, not judgmental. It doesn't care, what the movie is. And, stop. It's a way to stop thinking about yourself as the movie all the time. You get so caught up in the action of the movie that you forget that you're the screen.
Yes. And also that attachment is what we all have it. It's ego, right? And like
yeah.
You need ego, healthy ego at least to survive in the world, right?
And you need your mind to survive in the world.
Absolutely.
I mean, you need a thing that categorizes and analyzes things, or else you die. As you just walk right into a tiger. You have to be able to categorize
and that's the thing.
stuff.
I think a lot of this is like also considered in scientific terms metacognition, right? And what that means is like your survival brain is the limbic system, I think, right? I could be off on what the actual names are, but like the survival part of your brain that's like looking to keep you alive and identify things is your limbic system, and that's where also like your emotions are. And if you think about like what you want to get to is like the analytical part, kind of is I guess the frontal cortex.
Yeah, live there and not in the limbic.
Exactly. And
yeah.
so there's like this thing, I saw this thing recently, and it was a great explanation. If you think of like a 2-year-old or like a toddler throwing a temper tantrum, that's like they're just like freaking out. A lot of parents will say use your words. And what that is that it's trying to get the child out of their limbic into their prefrontal cortex, because then it gets to like a one observation away. You're like basically telling the child, instead of being in the emotion, I want you to identify it.
Yeah.
And so, which makes you step out of the emotion to identify it with language. And that's kind of what we're talking about here is like when you can start separating yourself and taking the observer seat, you have so much more power in your life because you're not in the limbic system of your brain of it like reacting to everything.
Where a lot of us live in the modern
Most of
world.
us do.
Yeah.
Most of us, and like most of us have no idea of like that there is that you can get out of ego and get into observant, right? So once you start like doing those reps with meditation or whatever it is, you start to see that like, oh, I can get in the observer seat and start looking at things from like more of like a strategic point of view of like a bird's eye view. And then also you can start to see that like, oh, all of this, we're all the same, right? Like that's the part too. That's like the key to it that comes into the non-duality.
Yeah.
I don't know if
Yeah,
that
I
was
agree. And
explained
we
well,
should
but
probably mention here too, like the other thing that puts you in your limbic system is what? Unresolved trauma.
100%,
Sorry.
yeah.
But 100%, right?
The
If you
things
go back
that
to our,
trigger you, right?
yeah,
Like the stuff
that's
when
it.
you're like, you get the hot rage flowing through you or the massive
Yep.
anxiety that like someone said one thing and then you're like ready to burn everything down or
Ready
like
to
run
Hulk
away.
out.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I used to be like that in my 20s big time, in my teens and 20s big time. I was very reactive,
Well,
very reactive.
I mean, geez, the rage like that I can feel. But the
Yeah,
thing is that therapy has done so much for me, at least with EMDR
me
therapy,
too.
is that
Yeah,
now instead of like when I feel that, I have the observer seat now
yeah.
where like I'm like, oh, I'm feeling these sensations that feel like anxiety or rage or whatever. And then
hmm
like I will often stop and like instead of being involved and like entangled in that, I'm like, oh, what is this? Oh, this feels like rage. What's the root of this? And then I can like kind of take a beat to like breathe it
hmm
out and then be
Yeah,
like, okay, what is the real thing that is like, what's the negative shit that I need to heal in
right.
order to respond to this and not Hulk out?
And it's usually some other button it's pushing, like your
It's
shame
always
button or
family.
your, like, it's always family. It's always,
It's always my Irish Catholic family. I'm like, damn it.
I'm laughing because it's true,
It's
man. It's so
100%
true.
true. I'm like, what did
It's
my
not
brother
just,
do when I
yeah,
was 5? Or what did my
right.
dad do?
Yeah, it's not just Irish Catholics, by the
No,
way.
I know.
Yeah,
But like, we're a special breed.
you are a special breed. That's absolutely true. Absolutely true.
Mm.
All right, so let's talk about how separation. I want to talk about separation and desire for a second
Sure.
because they're interlinked. And
Mhm.
so when we feel separate from people in our environment, we feel this lack in us, right? There's
Mhm.
something not complete. Whether that's we feel not enough in ourselves, or whether we feel we need to
Or
add
superior.
or superior. Yeah,
Yeah.
either one. Or yeah, sure, narcissist
Yeah.
definitely has
Which
to
is
have
really
these qualities, right?
really is about lacking though.
Yeah, it really is about lacking, right? So it's a lack of it's some feeling in us that creates this lack. We've attached to a thought or a feeling, and we have this like I need something to fulfill this thing. I think I talked in another episode. I like in my early life, like I really felt like there was a hole in me of some sort that I was trying to fill up all the time. Certainly when I got to my teens, that's
Was it
what
your
it was,
butt?
right? Oh my goodness, I knew you were going to say, "Was it my butt?" I knew you were going to say that.
Come on, I gotta go juvenile
Oh,
for
you're
a
so
moment.
good at that. So good at that. It was not my butt. It was like it was a hole in my soul of some sort that I wanted to fill up with things. So lack creates a desire, right? And it
Mhm.
creates a desire for something outside of us, right? When we don't feel like we're enough. And the idea, but I will say the idea behind non-duality is like it's not enlightenment is not out there. Your happiness is not out there.
Right.
Like everything is an inside job. It's just that it's been covered with ego and experience and conditioning and
Trauma.
trauma and
Mhm.
all of those things. And what you're doing to get to, understand more of a non-dual state of mind is that you're uncovering
Yep.
this, it's like a dusty jewel, right? You're just
Shoveling out the shit.
yeah, you're polishing off the facets,
Mhm.
to get that. So anyway, but when we feel that lack, we seek outside ourselves to satisfy the desire that we have. And we often take what we call unskillful actions that lead to suffering when we attempt to do that in forms of like sex, drugs,
Mhm.
consumerism, or other unhealthy behaviors. It can be a lot more subtle than that, in
A lot of
fact.
distraction from the
A
like
lot of
that, It's like
distraction or
yeah.
self-soothing
Yep.
or any of
Exactly.
those things, right? And they all ultimately they're all temporary and they all ultimately lead to more suffering, right? And
Mhm.
it's like I had this analogy that I pulled out with you the other day, which is like, if you're in a boat And that boat is your sort of your awareness, your well-being, all of that stuff. That boat can, if the boat's big enough, it can take on water and things like that. And you can bail out. If you're in the seat of the observer, you can be like, okay, well, there's some water in the boat. You get your bucket and you start bailing it out, and then you go on your journey. That's the thing, right? But if you're not, and you're attaching to those thoughts, and you're feel this sense of lack in you, and you reach outside for solutions, and you start to freak out, then you're like, oh, there's all this water in the boat. I know what I'll do to get rid of it. I'll drill more holes in the boat. That'll surely get rid of it, right? And then you're sinking. All of a sudden you're sinking. And that was like, that's what it feels like to me, is that, when I'm in that freak out mode, that I got my drill out. I'm like, I know how to get rid of this, and it's like,
basically
it's so
sailing
bad.
the Atlantic in a colander.
Yeah. Very temporarily, right? So this brings me to this thing that I'm really interested, that we were talking about the other day, Nora. It's the difference between desire and expression when it comes to taking action in the world, right?
Yeah.
And I'm talking a lot. I'm sorry. You need to chime in here.
No,
okay.
Please go. And I'm trying to chime in when appropriate. But
all right. So if we accept that desire is coming from a sense of lack arising from our thoughts, right, and we're attaching to some thought that makes us feel less than, and then that creates this desire outside of us.
Like the desire is like, if I have this certain thing, I will feel
right. If I have a Tesla, I'll feel a lot better. Right. Or if I smoke this joint, I'll feel a lot better.
Exactly.
Or if I do psychedelics, I'll feel a lot. Whatever it is, doesn't matter, right? So if we accept that that's true, and then we take unskillful actions to satisfy that lack, right? That's what desire is to me, right? There's this unskillful sort of, you're imposing your will. You're trying to impose your will on reality in a way that's not going to help you at all, right?
You're attaching to something outside of you in order to, like, the thought of something outside in order to feel good. And as we know, attachment causes suffering. So
right, exactly, right, exactly. Whereas expression in action comes from a sense of your own fullness or enoughness, right? So when we feel complete and like there's nothing missing from our lives or ourselves, our actions become a lot more spontaneous. They're a lot more in line with true nature, which is peaceful, non-judgmental, creative, and complete, right? So you can think of it like a little kid, right? When a little kid is playing, little kid doesn't care what you think about the play that they're doing. Little kid doesn't care about how loud they are. Little kid doesn't care about who's watching. Little kid is just expressing themselves, and it's just an overflow of their joy to be alive, or their creativity that's coming out of them, their innate completeness. They haven't been conditioned to not like themselves yet, to condition to like children should be seen and not heard type of thing, right? They are just pure expression at that point. And that's what I feel like the difference between,
desire,
the lack, the desire, and the expression is in the world. And you can think of that, in another way that we talked about the other day, which is sex and intimacy.
Yeah. So I had listened to this one trauma expert that kind of blew my mind. I think his name is Tim Fletcher.
Yeah, that's his name. Okay. That's his name. He's on YouTube all over the place. Y'all. You guys should go check out some Tim Fletcher, because he's really good.
He was discussing complex trauma, and he's like, he knows his shit. Let me tell you, dude, like, he really knows his shit. But I'm probably going to butcher this a little bit, but what he was like talking about there are so many people that will seek out, like, they desire sex, but only on like a shallow surface level. And what they're really their deeper expression that they want is access to intimacy, but they don't know how to get there because of traumatic shit in their lives. And so, they'll sleep around, and like they'll only go, this is really a terrible way to put it, but so deep. And I don't mean that in the sex sense.
Did you mean in the butt, or is that what? Gotcha. Gotcha with your own.
That one now, Paul.
I hoisted you on your own petard there.
There you go. Oh, it's all in you, right? No, but it's essentially like, there are so many people that will go out and they'll, and this is, I'm me trying to judge people, but it's like, but his talk about like people who will become addicted to sex, or, go around cheating, or, just what they're really,
excessive masturbation, all that stuff. Yeah.
Exactly. Like, it's all the stuff we're talking about there, that it's like these desires that are an attachment to something that they want to fulfill in themselves, that they perceive as like a lack. And really what they have access to is intimacy, if they really got rid of the trauma and the shit, if they processed that stuff in order to be able to access that.
And this is why it's so important to love yourself. And this is why it's so important to deal with your trauma. And this is why it's so important to try to fill yourself first. As you always say, Nora, you can't pour from an empty
Yep.
cup. And this is the essence of that saying right there. It's
Mhm.
like you can't give if you don't have anything to give, or you feel like you don't have anything to give. You know, the I can't remember who was it that said the quote about sex, but it's a great quote. It's like there's two ways to approach it. There's to approach it with an emptiness where you feel like you need to be filled up by the other
Right.
person. And there's a way to approach it with a
As an
fullness where you
expression.
feel like
Mhm.
it's an expression of your love and your
Mhm.
intimacy and your care for that person. And if both people are doing that at the same time, it's an incredible experience. If it's one-sided, it's not an incredible experience. If
Right.
neither person has it, it's like it's just like meaningless, you know,
Yeah.
biological systems working. You know, that's
Right.
all that's happening there. You know, and that can be, I think you can, you know, keep going with that sort of idea of emptiness and fullness in approaching almost anything in your life. I don't think there's a lot of things that are on the surface bad or good, you know, that people could make moral judgments about, like take marijuana, for
Mhm.
example, right? You know, if you approach it with an emptiness, like, oh God, I'm just trying to get away from my life, it's going to
The
have one
escapism.
effect on you. And
Yep.
if you
Mhm.
approach it with a, like, I'm already complete and I'm just going to, you know, this is
Let's
my,
see what this experience is.
let's see what this experience is. It's a whole different
Right.
experience, right? And the way people get down into addiction and down into bad, you know, not bad behaviors, but unskillful behaviors is by approaching everything as empty and trying to use those things to fill yourself, whether
Right.
that's sex or opioids or, you know, whatever. It doesn't matter.
That could be retail therapy, like, you
Retail
know, quote
therapy,
unquote,
trashy
anything,
novels, like whatever it
whatever it
is,
is, you
whatever
know.
it is, binging TV, any of those things, right?
Yeah.
They're all escapist, you
Yep.
know, type of temporary escapist things that ultimately just lead to more suffering, right?
And I get it. Like, I
Yeah.
definitely have my, like, little escapist things here and there, but I think the other thing on top of that is to be cognitive of when you're doing the escape. If
Oh
you're like
yeah.
the
Yeah.
escapism. Sometimes we just like it's shit can get hard, guys. You
Yeah.
know, like sometimes you just need to like watch Jersey Shore, binge watch Jersey Shore, have potato
Yeah,
chips
I
in
mean,
your brain.
I was just sick for 2 weeks, and like I couldn't do, I couldn't even meditate. I was had
Right.
such a brain fog, and like it was just a
Yep.
terrible illness that I had, stomach flu, like all that stuff. And what did I do? Of course, I binge watched TV, right? I mean,
What'd you
and
binge
read
watch?
some books, but then, huh?
What'd you binge watch?
I watched the Good Girl's Guide to Murder. That was one of the things I really
All
liked
right.
that one. But anyway, there we go. That's another episode.
I'm hoping someday you potato chip your brain with Jersey
I'm not
Shore.
watching Jersey Shore ever. You can forget about that. Forget about it. Forget about it. I've
Way
got
to
other trashy
judge.
TV that I do. All right, all right, all right. Moving on. I wanted to mention in this section, though, I wanted to mention the Taoist idea of Wu Wei, which I
Mhm.
think is really good, right? And it kind of sums up this how to approach action, right? Because I think oftentimes people are just trying to impose their will on the universe and on reality, and it ends badly most of the time. So the literal meaning of Wu Wei is non-doing or non-action, and that immediately is a little bit of a misnomer, and people take it for like, that sounds lazy to me or whatever. It's not that at all. It's not that you're not doing anything.
Mhm.
It's better to think of it as effortless action or actionless action. But really, effortless action is probably the best thing, right?
Mhm.
And it has to do, you can think of it as a flow state. You can think of it as going with the current. It's a behavior that arises from a sense of harmony with the Tao or with,
Mhm.
and the Tao is another way to say ultimate reality or another way to say Brahman or another way to say God, whatever, or the Force if you're a
Right.
Jedi, whatever. You know, I saw a podcast the other day that was the Ashtavakra Gita, which is a Hindu text for Jedis. And I
That's
was
awesome.
like, they just replaced the word God with the
The whole
Force or
Star Wars
Brahman with
thing
the
is
Force.
about that, though. That's
Oh, it's
the thing.
great.
I mean,
Yeah. I
Yoda
mean,
is
exactly. The
Yoda.
whole Star Wars
Like,
mythology is just all Eastern, most
mhm.
Eastern religion, Eastern philosophy. Anyway, so Wu Wei involves aligning yourself with the natural flow of life, right? So when you perform an action in the state of Wu Wei, it feels effortless, feels spontaneous. It feels like you're floating on a river with the current, right?
Yep.
And it has to do with non-interference. So it often involves allowing things to unfold naturally rather than imposing your will on something, which is what I was talking about in the last section there. And in practice, it might manifest as like intuitive decision making or graceful movement or flowing creativity. And we were talking about that in the context of dance, since we were both improvising dancers the other day, is that
Mhm.
you know when you're really inside of a partner dance and the everything disappears, you become one person with another person, and all you have in common is the music, momentum, your
In the
body is
present
like
moment.
the
Yeah.
present moment. That's a real state of Wu Wei
Yeah.
for me, yeah,
Yeah.
in there. So
Yeah. I was gonna add to that, like, I think like a great example if people haven't read this, of really non-dual like nature and what that would kind of be like to exist in that framework and with that kind of perception is Winnie the Pooh. And I don't know
Oh
if
yeah.
you've ever read The Tao of Pooh, but that's a
Yeah.
pretty great book where
It's a great book.
it is
Yeah.
a great book, and it really just like it explains Taoism and kind of non-duality
Yeah.
in through Winnie the Pooh and the characters there. But if you think of Winnie the Pooh, who's always kind of like accepts everyone, it's like radical acceptance. It doesn't matter if like Tigger's bouncing off the walls, or it doesn't matter if Eeyore is depressed or sad, and like it's like okay, and then it's just there's an interconnectedness that Pooh kind of recognizes and approaches everything with wonder and curiosity,
Yeah, and
right?
also with a tremendous sense of Wu Wei that we were talking about before. There's a
Exactly.
passage in House of Pooh Corner where Piglet asks him what he's doing, and he says, "I'm listening."
Yeah,
And he says,
exactly.
"Shouldn't you be busy doing something else?" He says, "I am busy.
Right, and
I'm
that's the
busy
observer.
listening."
Right, that's the
And he's like,
observer
"What are you
role.
listening to?" "I'm listening to that squirrel. I'm listening to that bug. I'm listening to
Mhm.
the wind through the whiz. I'm listening to all this stuff."
The present
That's
moment.
the
Mhm.
the present moment and the action of non-action.
That's
It's perfect. Yeah, I mean, you could
Pooh is
read Pooh.
always present.
Yeah, exactly. And you could
Yep,
read Pooh and get a lot of the same stuff. Yeah,
yep,
that you could from these dense, paradoxical,
yep.
faith-based tomes that I plow my way through on a daily basis. Right.
Yes, be like
So
Pooh, man, be like Pooh. I
yeah,
as in
be
Winnie
like
the
Pooh.
Pooh.
Yeah, then Winnie the Pooh. Yes, indeed.
Not a turd.
Yeah. Sorry, British listeners.
Oh boy. Okay, so where are we here in this conversation?
Well, we're at the wrap up point
All
here.
right, there
So
we go.
let's just go for a quick because that was a lot. I
Yeah, it's a
mean,
lot, and
there
it's a
was a
lot of
lot in there.
concepts, and it's like
Right.
we're kind of just like scratching the surface of a lot of this, but we want to really put this out to our listeners to like kind of if you really haven't heard of this, or if you heard of it you don't know anything about it, we're just trying to like give you a little like breadcrumbs to get you to really start thinking about, at least like conceptualize or to hold in your mind that like the possibility that we are all interconnected. And
Yeah.
this is the other thing I was going to say that I really want to say, like I think so many of our ills, as we were saying, in society really comes from this like separateness, and that really includes like the climate crisis, right? Like we
Hmm.
think we're separate from the planet and the universe and the ecosystem, and as we just continue to pillage it, we're really just pillaging ourselves, right?
Yeah.
And like when you don't have anything to eat, like it's a very fragile, balanced ecosystem that we're all connected to, and that
Right.
when you start screwing with it, you're screwing with everything.
And it's
And
not
so
just interconnectedness, it's interdependence, which I think is a really
yes,
good
thank you.
distinction to make, right? And
Yep.
we talked the other day, Nora, about how during the pandemic that became really clear
Mm,
that it really matters. I think Tim Waltz said this in his DNC speech this year,
mhm.
is that it really matters that your neighbors stay healthy.
It matters that someone matters for me in Philadelphia area that
Yeah.
someone in China was sick,
Yeah.
and I mean, we had a global pandemic for it, like, we all should care that this was going down halfway across the world because
Right.
it impacted all of us,
Right.
right? And that just shows the interdependence, and so
Yeah. Well, we have this idea about other countries or
right,
even as close as our neighbors. Oh, it's just our neighbors or
right.
whatever. Interdependent. We are
Mhm.
all dependent on each other, and we are dependent on the system in which we live, which is nature, which we
Yep.
are a part of, and we need to get back to. So,
Yes.
my advice, if you were going to do anything out of this episode first, would be to try to take the seat of the observer,
Mhm.
because I think
Practice that.
that's number one. Practice that,
Mhm.
and also as we've said in other episodes, getting to the point that we're talking about in this episode is a lot easier is if you also combine things together, like EMDR therapy,
Mhm.
like maybe psychedelics. Like I'm not going to advocate for any of those things, obviously, but in the
Find
combat,
your way.
find your way.
Mhm.
But in I find that the combination of things I've tried and am involved in have led me to a point where, because I meditated before I did EMDR, and I
Mhm.
meditated before I did psychedelics. I
Same.
meditated before but the quality of the meditation is different. And I'm not saying that
I agree.
psychedelics will get you there. Let's just take psychedelics out of the mix.
Mhm.
Let's just talk about dealing with your trauma, and that creates a real open space for you to be able to experience different stuff when you're not constantly triggered by misfiled memories and misfiled things
Yep.
in your brain. When you start getting things in the right drawers and the right folders, then there's a lot more space for you to experience something that's larger than yourself,
Absolutely. I
like
100%
non-duality,
have a
right?
very similar experience as you in that regard.
Yeah. So that's what I would say. The rest of the stuff, I mean, it's things to think about. The other thing is patience is so important. I didn't say this analogy before, but I wanted to mention this analogy I got from the great non-dual teacher Muji, who's on YouTube. If you haven't seen Muji, go check Muji out. He's very cool, very chill. Is that, your thoughts when you're in this process of trying to get to the seat of the observer, they can be like spinning around like a fan, right? And when you meditate, you're unplugging that fan. But guess what? When you unplug a fan, the blades still spin around for a while, right? So you have to be patient with yourself. Eventually, there will be fewer thoughts that crop up. Eventually, you might get to a point where you go, oh shit, there aren't any thoughts here. There's no experience here. Ooh, wait a minute. There's no ego here. So there's no me here. And there's like, that's a whole another level of, things. But from a practical perspective, I'd say if you can just observe your thoughts and be less reactive with the world, you've done everyone, including yourself, a great service.
Massive service.
A massive service. If we could all just get to that point, not total enlightenment and one with Brahman and all that stuff. If we could just get to the point where we aren't dicks all the time, it would be a lot better for everybody.
Exactly what you're saying. That I firmly believe that is our like truest personal power is to be able to respond to life and not constant. It's like playing chess versus checkers, when you get to that place where you can start strategizing your life and how you want to respond to it, rather than being like just people coming up and pushing your buttons and you like freaking out or getting sad or whatever. It's a huge personal power to be able to get to that point, at least to continually try to get to that point.
It's a thing to, I don't want to say strive for, but it's a thing to uncover. It's a thing to realize. It's a thing to, to look at, certainly.
You have access to it.
You have access to it. Yeah, everybody does. And it's immediate, but it may take time because you have all this conditioning and everything else on top of it. But as the Buddha said, I think in the Dhammapada, said, the greatest gift you can give to the world is your own transformation.
There you go. That's how you actually change the world.
That's how you change it, is you change yourself. You change or rather you uncover what's already there. There's no change necessary. I just want to make sure that's clear as well, right? You're not grasping for something outside and making a new you out of things. You're already it. There's a saying in Hinduism, thou art that, which means you are everything, right? And you are already the thing that you seek.
Whereas in Norism, it's you are the shit.
Okay. Fine.
You're the shit, dude.
You're shit, dude. Anyway, I love you, Nora.
I love you too.
Fantastic.
I found out that I think it was our last episode. We didn't say we loved each other. And I was like, I know. Wait a minute.
We're sorely disappointed, but we can't cut it in after, right? You're like, okay, this episode's over.
I'll tell you twice to make up for that last episode. I love you, man.
I love you too, man. All right, listeners, thanks for joining us this week. We super appreciate it. As usual, if you have any questions, you can always email us at the address after it's at the end of the episode here. It's always there. So give us a question, give us a comment. We always love to hear from you, and we will see you next time.
Peace out, homies.
Bye.
Cycle stays the same.
If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything you've heard on the show, please feel free to drop us an email at ifweonlyknewthenpod@gmail.com.